this title and the subtitle. So that's where I want to start. That's where I want to begin. Perhaps I could request all three of you to unpack the title and subtitle in terms of what it means to you, what you think about it, a freewheeling kind of,
I think there is an argument that literature, because of its institutional address, as caught as it is within the networks of production, distribution, and reception, is already a part of the social order, and hence is not very effective with respect to social activism. But acknowledging, not entirely disagreeing with that argument, I still believe that, as Marx famously said, there is always, relative autonomy to art. So I believe in that idea of the relative autonomy of art, wherein, irrespective of its, being implicated in the social order of, hierarchized order, I think literature still, and it has always, even if you go back in history, even to ancient history, whether in India or elsewhere, we see that literature is connected to social activism in one or the other form. But the question ultimately, and we see this in, with respect to many people, is whether it has become literature, whether social activism is, whether the work is merely that of activist work, or it has become literature. So very quickly, if you look at the works of writers as diverse as Kabir to Kanakadasa in Karnataka, to right up to the, Devanur Mahadev, we see that as against a number of others who were their contemporary writers, these writers, or Allama Prabhu, these writers were not merely, using literature as a vehicle of their activist ideas, but they were also, producing, they were also using literature itself as a means of, literature itself has to be activist, not merely a vehicle of activism. So therefore, I feel that unless it is literature, it cannot simply be an activist literature.
The session is called Storytelling and Activism.
Activism.
Yeah. So I
Writing the social script.
so I couldn't wrap my head around it. I didn't know what it meant.
Right.
But I'm sort of, going to partly respond and follow on from what you have said, Kamalakar. And then make reference, since you've invited me, because, or whoever it has invited me, because I have been, not just the book, but I have been I initiated a kind of project. I don't want to use a word as grand as movement in 2014, which I called literary activism. Right. And this book and other books in this series, which are part of a series called Literary Activism, and which are published by Westland Books in collaboration with Ashoka University, is the latest offshoot of that project. So a couple of things to say here. Literary activism as a project was started, I think, in part in response to what I called in the mission statement, which you can find on the website of literaryactivism.com, in response to what I called market activism. So market activism is a particular species of activity and language which has emerged in the post-fall of the Berlin Wall, globalized free market world, in which everything that we do, including, and I was talking about this in an earlier session, is subtly rephrased. and and uh, and you know serves the market without overtly saying it does. So market activism never speaks in terms of the market. That's an older phase where we had commercial, so-called commercial films or commercial books, literary books or art films. In the new phase, commerce doesn't speak in its own name. So in publishing, it will often speak in terms of classics and masterpieces. So I'll give you one example of this rephrasing and what I would call market activism. The rock star Morrissey wrote his autobiography, which I think he called autobiography, or my autobiography. And by this time, market activism was full-blown. It started in the 90s, around the time when huge amounts of money began to be paid to, say, good writers like Donna Tartt, Vikram Seth. Those were the watershed moments, just in the time of deregulation. But huge amounts of money for books which were then immediately described quite often as masterpieces. A masterpiece is a literary idea. It has an old sort of resonance from literary history. So these words were being reused. Now, if you look at Morrissey said, yes, I will give my book to Penguin as long as they publish it as a Penguin classic. So the word classic was also appropriated in this rephrasing of market activism. So they said, oh, right, we do want to publish you. What about publishing you as the book as a Penguin modern classic? So no, it has to be Penguin classic. So, going back to the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Upanishads and all of that.
Was he serious or was it some kind of...
He was dead serious, because by then he knew that classic in this new post-deregulation world is a market activism term. So he was published as an instant classic, and it went straight to #1, the book. Literary activism is posited to inquire into this language. So the language of the masterpiece, of the classic, of literary value was in academia thrown out of the window as being, dubious constructs by the elite sections of society. The canon. If you remember the arguments about the canon. Yeah, so canon keeps out much more than what it takes in. So academia was no longer, from the 90s onwards, talking about things like masterpieces and classics, unless it were to interrogate these categories. But these terms were picked up by what I call market activism, which would never speak in its own name. That it would never say, I am going to publish a book which I think will sell 100,000 copies if it's a literary book. They would instead say, I'm going to publish a classic. Yeah. So literary activism was meant to interrogate or to look into this new world we were living in, and to look at the desultoriness, by contrast, the powerlessness, the empowering, to use a cliched word, powerlessness of the literary, to look at its haphazardness, to look at its desultoriness as a form of opposition to this particular language. So that's how literary activism started. The word activism itself, this is the last thing I want to just add here, goes back in our history and history in general to the emergence of the modern, say with Raja Ram Mohan Roy, as the progressive. So the moment we begin to think of the modern Indian, the earliest examples we think of this emergence into modernity is the progressive. And the activist is a descendant of the progressive. However, by the 1860s, in Bengal, poets like Tagore are emphasizing a kind of unregulated play of the imagination as a critique of the teleological sort of thought process of the progressive, of the Ram Mohan Roys. what they want is disruption and play. So this literary activism, I would posit in that world of play, which critiques various things, including just a narrowly progressive understanding of the world.
Thank you. I'll come back to some of the things that you've spoken about. May I request Srikar to respond?
Yeah, so the first thing that came to my mind when I saw the title, possibly because I worked as a...
This one's not audible.
Yeah, so the first thing that came to my mind, possibly because I worked as a screenwriter in Mumbai for a while, was Mario Vargas Llosa's novel, Aunt Julia and the Scriptwriter. Some of you might have read this. And so the scriptwriter here is this guy called Pedro Camacho, who writes serial soap opera scripts for a radio show in Lima in Peru. And Pedro Camacho is a very gifted storyteller, but he has one fatal flaw, which is that he's a confirmed bigot of the highest order. And he just hates Argentines for really strange reason. And he's a fanatical writer. He writes 16 hours a day. The stories just come tumbling out of him. He doesn't even need to edit them. And after a while, the show gets really popular, but then these anti-Argentine tropes start coming into the show, and there's a bit of a ruffle in society, like what's happening. And then slowly, his entire fictional universe starts to degenerate, and then the characters from one story are going into another. And then by the end, there's almost a systematic destruction of every single character. Cities burn down, everyone dies gory deaths, ships are sunk, and so on. And I brought this up because in my book, I interview in one of my chapters this Kannada TV serial director, T.N. Sitaram, who I think has a panel a few hours from now right here. And if you look at T.N. Sitaram shows, around the turn of the millennium, he wrote and directed and acted in shows called Mukta, which are on YouTube. And if you see them, they have like millions of views and hundreds of comments. And so unlike Pedro Camacho, Sitaram shows have survived the test of time. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Sitaram is anything but a bigot. And one of the things I ask him in my interview is, so some of his more recent shows tend to be very depoliticized. So early on his work, so he plays this hotshot lawyer who's defending ordinary people, women, farmers. He's championing environmentalism, feminism. He's calling out, crony capitalists and corrupt politicians and all sorts of shifty, dubious characters.
Sounds like a 70s Hindi movie.
And incidentally, Sitaram himself is a product of the 70s. He was a big student of Lankesh, and so he was baptized in those times. So that's
progressive politics.
Yeah, the progressive activists. And so I asked him, well, what was the shift? Why did this shift happen? And he said, look, earlier, Doordarshan was where my shows used to come, and Doordarshan was owned by the people. But then afterwards, he started coming on ETV. ETV was owned by Ramoji Rao, and he said he was still a cool guy. He didn't, bother about censorship and so on. But now, almost everything is owned by Ambanis, and he says, now I can't say stuff like big businessmen cheat the common man. And so, as you alluded to, in this case, it's not, the script has been changed, not so much by Sitaram's choice, but by the cold hand of neoliberalism, You have to, it's invisible, it's all out there.
Market activism at work almost.
Yeah. And of course, the most egregious aspect of corporate domination is how news has resolved into, it's Pedro Camacho minus the storytelling. That's what you see on TV right now. And that's an interesting space, journalism as a combination of storytelling and activism that can be reimagined and refashioned, I think, with very timely effects.
I'm going to ask you the next question specific to your book, specifically about its title, Rama, Bhima, Soma. I think there's a story there.
It's basically a schoolboy game. Some of you might have played it. Some of you might have played it under a different name, but it's a South Indian game. I've basically, all you need is a ball, and we used to play it all the time when we were in school. So you throw the ball in the air 3 times. I mean, it falls 3 times. Each pitch you count off as Rama, Bhima, Soma, and then whoever is nearest to the ball picks it up and starts chucking it, everybody else around you. And I found a metaphor of democracy in there somewhere, because constantly you're alternating between power and powerlessness, between the individual and the collective. You identify as yourself when you're throwing, but as part of the mass when you're on the receiving end. And there seems to be this complex web of interrelationships that felt to me as a sort of ideal to aspire for through the book itself, where I'm talking about different ideas, different ideologies, different types of activists, different modes of thinking about the world, and how they talk to each other. And I thought this title might be a nice way to, point to that web of interconnection.
And I have been reading your book for a bit. It is based on something of the storytelling model. You are trying to use storytelling, journalistic
better
model.
or worse, some of us are storytellers, and as much as I enjoy listening to. Yeah.
No, so he's used, as he says, and my question is to you, Amit, he's used the storytelling method kind of to investigate what went on in the political, cultural, and social spheres of modern Karnataka. And interestingly, your book is titled Against Storytelling, right? And I would really, the book that you edited is a title Against Storytelling. And that's kind of interesting to me as a writer, as a novelist. You have told stories, right? And now you're talking about against storytelling. And I was very curious to ask you to expand on this paradigm shift, is it? Or am I completely misreading the plot here?
You and I might be on the same page. I don't know how you're using the word storytelling. So that's only a term.
Right.
I'm looking, when I say against storytelling, I'm looking at a number of things, including the kind of claim that we began to hear from the 80s onwards, saying that human beings were basically storytellers. Right. And taking it one step further, that people from non-European cultures, were exposed to, or that storytelling was integral to those cultures, and that the European kind of the more sort of the cultures whose modernity were more identified with the Enlightenment were seen to be, there was also this thing going on between orality and storytelling on the one hand, and the inscribed on the other. And I began to think, what is leading to this? I had grown up I had been formed by a culture of the poetic, and and once you invest in the poetic, you are invested not only in telling, but in not telling.
Okay.
And all writing, whether it's fiction or poetry, if for me, if it is to work, has a great investment in what it does not say. And what it does not say is what what gives it its particular shape and power. The power, that's one thing. The power of the writing comes from what is left out, not from what is added. That's the principle on which I work, and I think many writers work. Many writers work. I was formed by that particular poetics. Then I began to see this kind of almost tyrannical emphasis on not only story and storytelling, but its cultural identification with certain cultures, and the fact that that it was somehow that storytelling and saying and orality and testimony, because it led to testimony, had somehow a moral and empowering value. And in the midst of all this, the power of the not said, the deliberately unsaid, which informs writing, but it also informs, say, Hindustani classical music khayal, the way the khayal unfolds, is not a quick and overt declaration of the rag and establishment of the rag, but a prevarication. So it seemed to me that a great deal was being left out. The second thing I would say is that story, for me, is something that leaves out what is most interesting, and that is life. Story, to me, is an offshoot of a human-centric idea. Actually, although these ideas come about as critiques of the Enlightenment, they're still sort of a progeny of the Enlightenment in that they still deal with a very human-centric idea of the story, narrative, and the novel. That it must be about the protagonist. Everything else in the story is, let's say, a table or the floor is important in as much as it's part of the story of the protagonist. Now, to me, the table and the floor are as important as the protagonist's story. To not be able to make space for the table and the floor and stay with it for as long as I stay with, or maybe longer than I stay with the protagonist, is a suppression of what the imagination does. So to me, what is interesting lies on the fringes of story. And what is on the fringes of story? It's the encounter with life. For which my material instances, but also my metaphors, are floor and table. That the encounter with life. How do we bring back a discussion which addresses these spaces? And there's one last thing which if I have time, I'll come back to later, is the continuity between the idea of narrative and globalization, the turn towards narrative. The narrative turn, among which the global is one. We are all part of this wonderful narrative. We are all, even the literary festival is a microcosm in the larger narrative of bonhomie, that is free market globalization. What if you don't want to take part, or if you're unhappy, or if you know, the right to be unhappy?
No, I just want you to respond quickly to this. No, Amit, and then I'll come to you, because I have a very pointed question about your book. But I'd like to, Amit, this what can I say? This moving away from leaving some things to the imagination almost, right? Not telling, which has happened in the recent past. Is it an outcome of the visual culture that we now exist in? Has the visual culture therefore influenced the writing so much that, since we can see everything visually now?
No, I don't know whether it's well, it's a corollary of various things, various kinds of turns within both the left and the right.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, but it is a de-education of things that were important and rediscovered in the time of modernity. This whole business of not saying.
Right. Okay.
The image, for instance, the image is, what did Pound call it? An emotional and intellectual complex in an instant of time. That's what he called the image. Now,
Right.
if it's an emotional and intellectual complex in the middle, if that's in an instant of time, that's what's enough for you, then you're not concerned about, well, what is the backstory of the image? What's the what's the sociological context? You do not approach it as this model that the sociological context is in the anterior of the image, and it leads to the image. You do not. It's not that you deny sociology, but you don't
Engage with
this in this particular fashion, this sequential fashion. Oh, so this is the context. This is what it leads to. No, you're confronting the image. You're confronting the moment. It unravels your sequential way of understanding, the context to the product of context.
It seems like Pound was almost speaking to Andy Warhol, who said, in the future, everyone will be world famous for 15 minutes.
So this is happening. There's a period in which this is happening, and then there is a great hostility to all of this.
Right. Now, my question to you, Kamalakar, is this. And since you're a professor of English literature, I must say this question is kind of out of syllabus, right? So my question is, as someone who teaches English literature, as someone who has translated Kurtkoti, who is a very well-known Kannada critic, would you, as a teacher and as a translator of criticism, right, would you perhaps respond to the Amit's, comments on what is changing in terms of storytelling and what is emerging therefore? Would you like to respond to all of that?
While I'm collecting my thoughts in response to that, let me say this about Kurtkoti's significance as a literary critic, because I think that also something that he says in this title essay also. Kurtkoti was not doing literary criticism in the way in which we generally understand, especially after his first book, first couple of books. After he started writing, as D.R. Nagaraj somewhere has mentioned, after he started writing columns, he started writing something very, very different. He had this great enthusiasm for literature. One can say that he uses this word very often, heretic. And there are many stories about how the Manohar Granthamala attic used to be a place where he would kind of hold forth on literature, and he had this great enthusiasm wherever he went, whatever forum, whether it's a lecture, whether it is a seminar, he would speak about literature and no other matter. Now, I think he brings that enthusiasm to even writing, where he converts criticism into something that tries to communicate that enthusiasm. As a result of which, I think what he did with this form of writing is that he tried to develop that into a form of writing that would create an intimate way of talking about literature, creating an intimacy. So I think that is what is new about him, about his literary criticism in terms of the way he wrote about it. Another is his encyclopedic vision. There is something to be said about writers who bring that kind of an, even when they are writing about individual authors or individual works, they focus on number of ideas and number of forms and history. It's as if they are able to look at the wood without missing the tree. And I think Kurtkoti also brings in that kind of a vision, which is something that many people, even those who didn't like his book, especially his first book, acknowledge, the kind of breadth of vision that he brought to his criticism. So those two I would like to kind of, mention
forward
at the outset as among some of his major, qualities of criticism.
Right. Now, my question to you, Srikar, is this, and I'm shifting gears here, right? We have dwelt on storytelling a fair bit. I am now shifting gears to the activism bit, right? And this is where I think your book seems extremely interesting, because you're actually looking at modern Karnataka, you're looking at social cultural movements, political movements, and all those are forms of activism,
Undoubtedly.
right? And all those, to some extent, are also reflected in the literature that one sees.
To a great extent, actually.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So therefore, then, is literature influencing activism? Is it vice versa? Or am I being too simplistic here, even in asking that question?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost impossible to answer it. It's both ways. It goes both ways. One feeds the other supplies impulse and vigor to, writing as such. And just one small comment about something, the image and the text thing you asked.
Right.
One thing I'm noticing is the phenomenon of subtitles, for instance. It seems like a resurgence of the text. Even now, if you watch movies, especially translations and other foreign languages and so on, you just need the subtitles. You can't watch a movie without a subtitle anymore. And even on social media, most people just watch on mute. There's videos with subtitles going. You don't even listen to stuff anymore. So the text can't be eradicated the image can't completely supersede the text, I think. But yeah, coming back
in
to...
some sense, the text is therefore coming back.
Yeah.
It was more visual earlier. Now, because of various reasons, the
Maybe.
text is actually coming back.
The literary activism bit, I just want to go to one particular event and chapter and interview that, so I interviewed this poet, playwright, activist called Kodganhalli Ramaya. So he started this institution called Adima in Kolar. And this sort of came out of the remnants of the Dalit movement in Karnataka, where they realized, look, we need to go down to the grassroots, start a cultural movement. And so it's a very interesting experiment with theater as an alternative, holistic sort of education. And so I was interviewing him, and we came to this one particular event in 1980. So there's this murder of a tenant called Sheshagiriyappa. It happens in Kolar. So these are, so this is just after Devaraja's land reforms, and there's a lot of tumult happening. So basically, all tenants submit a petition, and then if it's accepted, you get land. And some places had great success, like South Canara, partially in Kolar, not so much across the state. But what happens here is, this guy, Sheshagiriyappa, he asks for land. He's murdered by the landlord called Krishna Gowda. And this Krishna Gowda is also accused of raping Sheshagiriyappa's daughter. And so there's this unprecedented protest march from Kolar to Bangalore, where they take out a foot march. And it so happens that this guy is in Gundu Rao's kitchen cabinet. Gundu Rao is chief minister, particularly inept chief minister. And so they lathi charge this procession while it comes to Vidhan Sauda. And so I asked Ramaya, how did this, because it set the tone for the movement in the state at large. So I asked him, why do you think it happened? Did the media play a big role? And he said, no, it was because of the songs. The media don't do anything. And in fact, he'd written...
Which songs?
He'd written a song called Nanatangi Anusuya, My Little Sister Anusuya. And I even met a 50-year-old man who must have been 10 years old back then. He remembers participating in that, singing that song and writing slogans on the wall and so on. And so Ramaya went into this elaborate monologue about how important songs were, how they fled organically, they spread into villages. So they're moving from village to village. By the time they reach, the song has already traveled before them, and so on. And this was the most direct story of literary activism that I heard about. And so this institution itself, he wanted it to change how children relate to the world, to open up the possibilities of imagining better imaginative spaces for children.
One question to you before I like to throw it open for questions in the audience. The writers you mentioned at the beginning, those who felt literature could cause social change, right? They would have approved of something like this, right? The song sparking off an entire march, an entire movement of sorts, an entire... Because many of these progressive writers, for instance, I'm just giving one instance, they believed that their literature was to create social change almost, isn't it?
Yes, definitely. But my point is also that, take for example, Namdev Dasal,
Right.
icon of Dalit Panthers in Maharashtra. But it's not very easy to read his poetry. I mean, I simply want to say that even when it is, or for that matter, Kabir, or for that matter, Allama Prabhu. So there is something, I think, what Amit ji said also, there is something that it takes beyond the, statement level, sloganeering level of literature. And by the sheer fact that writers like Namdev Dasal or Devanur Mahadev, they are so inspirational, which simply suggests that literature, when it is literature, also can be activist.
Right. I mean, there's so much more that I'd like to ask all of you, but I think I should request the audience to ask questions. Can I start with you and I'll come to you next? Can someone pass a mic to her? You can have the mic from here if you wish.
Hello. My question is specifically to Amit. So earlier we were speaking about what to say and what not to say in a in a writing, in a storytelling sense. So I wanted to ask, how do you decide what to say and what not to say? How do you decide where to handhold your audience, where to leave things to their imagination, because that would totally depend upon the kind of audience you are targeting. So how do you decide what I should be leaving to a visual imaginary, and what I should be describing in detail about?
Thank you for that question. You want?
No, please, go ahead.
Okay. I'm trying to collect my thoughts and give
Maybe
you
we'll
an
take
answer.
the next question and we'll come back. Your
Yeah.
question, by which time. Please wait for the mic.
Hello, Amit. This question is, in a sense, resonates with the earlier question.
Oops.
Yeah, but so the response can be a combined response. There is also storytellers, like you said, are leaving a lot of things unsaid. But also readers are listening partially, or being more and more selective in reading the kind of stories. So between this conspiracy, shall I say, can I use the word conspiracy? Between this conspiracy of silence among readers and listeners, and a pornography that blurs mythia with myth, what is happening to activism?
See, these questions have very complex answers. We would need another session to talk about mithya and myth. But let me just try and do
Sure.
to answer as quickly as possible. One, there are many things one is working against at any given point of time. So when you start writing in a moment in history, in my case it was, let's say my first novel came out in 1991, so the moment in history I embarked upon writing fiction would have been the end of the 80s, okay? So that moment in history was the moment leading to the fall of the Berlin Wall, and also to the emergence of certain free market globalization verities, including one of which included the idea of the Indian novel, which was basically the Indian novel in English after Rushdie. And that was one of the categories that one was dealing with, which said that the Indian novel in English after Rushdie is Indian writing, and Indian writing has rediscovered itself, and Indian writing, like India, is large, polyphonic, and garrulous. And then when I looked at Indian writing, I saw that a lot of it was compressed, poetic, and full of elision. So I thought, what happened to that Indian writing? Whether we are talking about poems in Prakrit, or whether we're going further back, or whether we're looking at the languages in which people wrote from the 19th century onwards, like Bengali or Kannada or whatever the language might be, full of instances of compression. I gravitated towards the compressed because that was the way I wrote. So my gravitation towards the Indian languages had to do with my gravitation towards a poetics of modernity, not towards authenticity. The debate became couched in this. Oh, there's the Indian writers in English, and then there's the Indian writers in the Bhasha languages. Whatever in Bhasha, because Bhasha language, it's a tautology. Bhasha means language. Every language, including English, is a Bhasha. So the dichotomy was one of authenticity on the one hand and globalization on the other. I was moving towards the Bhasha literatures because of my attraction to a poetics of the modern, which I found most, in India, most vibrantly over there. This included acts of play and non-saying, not saying. Now, how do I work with this as a writer? Is that a kind of protest against?
Almost out of time.
Yeah. One is, I think what you're militating against are not are universals and dead categories. Language is made up of dead categories. Every time we speak, we are speaking in dead categories which have very long histories and contain shifts which have pervaded the language and left it, unable to say anything, but yet we keep speaking in that language. So the word the, as opposed to the word a, the way you arrange the syntax of a language, whether it's moving from the point of view of the subject or not. All of these unsettle the deadness of language. All of these are a struggle with the deadness of language. This is what you're doing. This is what craft is about, not to make your language more beautiful, but to bring it back to some sort of intellectual and artistic life, which is very, very difficult to get to, because at every moment, the history, the dead histories in which we speak, all our categories reassert themselves. They're even there in our definite articles, in the grammar of what we say, in the way we construct a sentence.
Thank you. That was very, 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 I don't know. I have a lot more questions to ask you after that, but I will stop here. Thank you very much for being such an engaged audience. Thank you for the stories you've told us and how you've told us not to tell us certain things. Thank you very much.